reproduction itself. So reproduction ensures that a species doesn't become extinct. So without having kids, you will run the risk that you will not be able to continue as a species. And that is a big problem with human beings nowadays, where like more and more people are just not having kids. All right, and there are two different types of reproduction. So we have asexual, which is without the formation of gametes, whereas sexual is the fusion of male and female gametes. And remember, when they fuse, eventually it's going to change into a what's that thing called? A zygote, and eventually form a fetus, well, that's more human, but we'll talk about that later. All right, some plants reproduce both sexually and asexually, and through this we'll discover why it is important that sometimes it needs to be sexually and why other times it needs to be asexually, because during different sort of scenarios, people and plants choose to go through one or the other, and some just have the ability and some don't. So let's talk about asexual reproduction. So this is specifically by spores. We'll do how more evolved plants deal with that later. So I just want to remind you, this is from Grd11. And this is in mosses and ferns. They reproduce both asexually and sexually. So let's just deal with asexually more specifically. They produce these spores. The spores germinate into gametophyte plants. And remember, those gametophytes can be male and female. To a large extent, mosses produce separate mature gametophytes into one male, one female, whereas in ferns they produce a prothallus, which is that heart shape, and on there you'll find both male and female gametes. So in more evolved plants, specifically angiosperms, so those are plants that produce covered seeds. We're going to talk about vegetative parts of the plant. So vegetative are parts that kind of break off, and as a better word, we're going to use the term explants. Okay, and those explants are anything that you use from the plant to be able to self-propagate the plant. And by propagate, I mean like grow from the individual itself, but like slightly off, like you've cut something off when you use it. So those examples are roots, stems, and leaves. We'll talk about how those work a little bit later. And then also when we get back to class, I'll explain the formation of like callus and all those other wonderful bits and pieces. And these divide by mitosis to form new plants from the parent plant. So to a large extent, when we go through asexual reproduction, we're going to be creating clones, but we'll deal with the advantages and disadvantages of that later. Okay, so in front of you, you see this structure. This is what an onion technically looks like as a diagram of through a cross section. And the part I want to point out over here is the reduced stem. So that reduced stem itself, once you have cut off all the leaves and you keep the stem intact, you can actually replant that stem into the ground, even if there's very few roots, and will regrow the roots as well as those leaves. So the onion part that you may or may not enjoy in your food is actually leaves. You're eating leaves, and that comes off that reduced stem. So we can use the stem to regrow the parts. So this is a beautiful geranium. You recognize it from the leaves. If you don't, well, sorry for you. So over here, they've cut a piece of it off, and they've literally just shoved it into the ground as is. This is technically an explant, so when you've cut a chunk off of the parent plant and you regrow a new part. So the stem in this instance will recognize it does not have roots, and we'll deal with auxins and cytokinins very briefly when we get back to school, or maybe later in the digital lesson series. And when you plant it, it's just going to grow. And what you can actually do is you can do this with roots as well. Oh man, what's roots? Roses. So you can cut off a piece and you can leave it in water for a couple of days, and you'll start seeing the production of roots, or the growth of roots at the bottom. And those roots will then, you can plant it and you'll get an entire new individual from that. Please also remember that we're going to use this specifically if this geranium or this plant has very strong genes. So its flowers are beautiful, maybe it smells really nice, maybe it's an exceptional color of green, and we want to make clones of that so that we can sell it. So this will be selective breeding. Then we have this bad boy over here. I know that strawberries do this, and in this instance, this isn't this plant here, but if you guys know of the spider plant or hen and chicken, they do this quite often, where they grow these little side stems or runners. and these grow further and like away from the parent plant or the main plant. Remember, they want to reduce the amount of competition that they have with their offspring, and when that runner hits the ground, it starts to produce roots, and when it produces roots, the internode falls off and the new plant then grows from that. Okay, so again, these are clones, and you can keep on producing these runners and actually take over wildly. So a lot of these plants we actually don't put in our garden, and we keep them in pots because they can grow so rapidly and produce new offspring so quickly that it introduces so much competition that a lot of the plants in the area will die. Potatoes, specifically the tubers, okay, so they're technically a type of underground stem as well. Remember that these things are made out of leukocytes. So the leukocytes themselves are a plastid that stores starch, and these are underground, which means that there's no need for photosynthesis to occur. Remember, photosynthetic tissue or chloroplasts will only be found in parts that are exposed to the sun. So when you have your potatoes at home and you leave them outside for like in your vegetable rack in the sun for too long, they're actually going to start producing something called eyes, in this instance called a lateral bud, and you can see those bits and pieces growing off of the potato over there. If you cut a nice big square around that and you pull that out of the potato and plant that in the ground, you would actually produce a brand new potato from that. Okay, so there is a lot of cells, and it's not like we're just looking at the leukocytes, the leucoplasts themselves. We're looking at the whole cell, and because of all that stored up starch, it's able to regrow roots, stems, and leaves very quickly, and we can mass produce these to a large extent, and that's just by exposing it to some sunlight. All right, so let's look at the advantages of asexual reproduction. You only need one plant. Offspring are genetically identical. New plants are produced relatively quickly. Now think about this. Why would you want to reproduce really quickly? Is this because it's in an environment that is exposed to lots of external factors such as droughts, maybe very little nutrients in the soil, maybe there's very infrequent rain, maybe there's a whole bunch of reasons why it could happen. So if you are in a very bad situation, you can make rapid clones of yourselves, ensuring that those genes themselves are going to be produced. Agents of pollination and seed dispersal are not required whatsoever because there's no pollen and there's no ovules. So it will just go through the process of mitosis extremely rapidly, and through that extreme rapid reproduction, it will then produce new plants. And people can select desirable characteristics. We spoke about this earlier, about how if I find a particular rose that has very big petals, or maybe the roses smell nice, or maybe they grow very vigorously and produce lots of flowers themselves, we can actually chop a chunk off of that, and then we can regrow that a little bit. This isn't necessarily the same as selective breeding, and I know I did that with one class and not the other, so we'll do that when we get back as well, and we'll revisit that. But you know, this is just choosing a clone that is extremely good at what it does. So disadvantages of sexual reproduction. So we can have genetic weaknesses can be passed on to the offspring. So let's say you had a plant that didn't actually grow extremely well in a lot of environments, and it started reproducing more of itself. It means that that plant is an extremely high probability that it will die. Or let's say it's a very strong plant and there is one particular virus or bacteria or fungus that it infects that plant specifically, and it is not infected for many generations, and then all of a sudden this disease washes through. That means that all of them will die. And a couple of years ago, a lot of people were planting a plant called busy lizzies. I don't know, you'll have to Google it, I can't remember the name of it right now, but if you pop the seed pod, it like burst open. And those plants were being mass produced and sold all over the place for their beauty, and you know, they were pink and white and like these off red colors. And there was a whole, I think it was for about 2 years, where there was a virus that was infecting it and causing them to rot. So, you know, they were creating these clones because they were beautiful, but in the end, it actually ended up doing more damage because not even the nurseries themselves could sell because there was no genetic variation within all of this. If there are any changes in the environment, then the plant is likely to die off because of no variation. And remember that plants are very much like humans. They like acclimatize to certain areas. So if a plant cannot acclimatize, or it does acclimatize and the plant is moved and it can't adapt to its new environment, it will just die. So that is called genetic plasticity, which we'll also deal with much later. So let's look at sexual reproduction and why it's important. So it occurs in most plants and animals, involves fusion of sperm cells with the ovum to form a zygote. The zygote develops into an embryo, that's the word I was looking for earlier, which divides by mitosis several times to form a new individual. Remember that mitosis comes back from grade 10, and one of the main biological reasons for mitosis was for repair, replacement, and growth. Okay, so this is where that growth component comes in. Flowers are sexual reproductive structures, so I just want to remind you that when you give someone flowers, you're technically giving them the male and female reproductive parts of the plant and saying, here, shove your face in it and sniff how nice it smells. Flowers produce male and female gametes and attract pollinators. So any of those of you who technically sneeze a lot during spring, it's technically because you are allergic to the male reproductive gametes of a plant, which is pretty stiff. But they are used to attract pollinators, these flowers, and that's based on scent, as well as nectar produced, as well as the color of the flower. And notice that not all flowers are the same colors. You have warm colors, such as your reds, oranges, and yellows, and you have your cold colors, which are your purples, your greens, and not so often blue, funny enough. And I want you to go and Google the reason why there is not the pigment for blue, funny enough. So even though flowers look blue, they're actually more purple than they are blue. Okay. And then finally, here's a definition for pollination. It's a transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Okay, and that can either be, depends how that pollen is moved, and we'll deal with adaptation. So it can either be by wind, it can be by pollinator, and a whole bunch of other bits and pieces. So let's look at the advantages of sexual reproduction. Offspring are genetically different, and I cannot express how important this is, because if you are genetically different, it's really going to help in terms of variation within the species itself. Okay, and it is important, and it's good to have this variation because it's going to allow for adaptations to occur between two different organisms, or maybe one organism is good at adapting at multiple like damages such as droughts and wind and all those kinds of things, whereas the other one isn't, and those can be shifted along. This is ultimately going to lead to, well, this variation, which will lead to evolution eventually. Okay, so here we go. Variation within a population is the basis of evolution and allows offspring to adapt and evolve in ever-changing environments. So we're not saying evolve as in like become a brand new species. I'm talking about how we can share our DNA, and that DNA is ultimately going to allow for different individuals to be able to survive in different environments. And if that survives and the other plants die, that would lead to that natural selection. And if that species continuously changes, it would then eventually cause speciation, creating a new plant. So variation may lead to the formation of new species. Okay, and we spoke about that earlier, about how one will survive and the other ones won't, and if they continue changing with a whole bunch of random genetic mutations because of mutagens, then it could cause a brand new species. What are the disadvantages though? So first of all, it's slower than asexual reproduction, but it is still better. So we find that plants actually respond in very different ways. So when it is under extreme stress, that is when it's going to actually go through through sexual reproduction, whereas when times are good, it's going to go through asexual reproduction, and that is because of the idea of genetic variation. So asexual reproduction, that is good when times are good because you can create clones that will survive in that environment. However, if things change, this particular individual is not going to survive. So you will then want to go through sexual reproduction so that you can fuse your DNA with another plant, and hopefully that offspring will survive as a seed and wait out the bad environments and or create species that will survive in the dangerous environment. So unfavorable genes and mutations may be passed on. So even though we're saying the clones might not be able to survive and there's bad genes that are passed on, it's even worse when the pollen from a damaged, or like a plant that has bad genetics, fuses with ovules, or even the ovules could have bad genetics, and that causes plants to not survive particularly well. So pollen transfer and seed dispersal often need outside agents like insects or birds. And that can be a bit of a train smash because, let's say, for instance, we're talking about the colony collapse sort of between a whole bunch of bees, or it's just not the correct season. So, bees are functional throughout the year, but they don't function very well during winter. So you'll just have to adapt yourself to be in attract some sort of either new dispersion agent or just wait it out so that you'll not produce your seeds. And that's often why a lot of plants produce a lot of offspring and seeds and fruit during spring. Well, they start. So that's why all your flowers are produced during spring, so that during summer we can have a good development of seeds and fruits, and those fruits can fall off and land and start developing, so that by winter we have some sort of developed embryo or at least a mini plantlet, which can then start developing and actually grow through the winter season, and then the whole process just goes around and around and around. All right, so I'm going to leave it over there. In the next lesson, we're going to be dealing with the adaptations and how you can figure out whether a plant is dispersed by wind, seed, or animals, and how some of them deal with during the day and during the night. And then also I'm going to go over the structure of a flower and why that is important. And we're going to do a little bit more botany so that you guys are smart by the end of this. All right. Well done, Matrix. Remember, I'm super proud of you and you guys have got this, and I hope plants are going well.